Voila. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first lecture on Module 9 on competition law and the regulation of network industries. For this session, we have the honor to welcome Lorenzo Coppi, who is an executive vice president based in Compass Lexicon, London and Milan. So we say hi to London today. He has more than 20 years of experience in the applications of economics to competition law cases and regulation. So as I said, from now to quarter to three, Lorenzo will will start answering questions about the videos, and then we will divide the group into breakout rooms of groups of 3 to 4 people. During 20 minutes, you will discuss the case studies. And then one person should be the speaker for the group to discuss their impression and their thinking about the case studies, give their insights, and so on. And then at 2, you will join back the meeting room to discuss the case study together with Lorenzo. And then you will finish this lecture with a short presentation of the regulation in the energy sector. We will do a short break in between these 2 lectures, and then at 3, as I said, Karol Maskowicz is joining us for the presentation on competition law regulation in the railway sector. She has developed a cutting-edge expertise in state law regulation of network industry and the public contracts with the Belgian and the European authorities. So she has worked a lot with the public authorities as well. So please don't hesitate to open your microphone today. I think both sectors are really interesting nowadays. So ask your question. Lorenzo, thank you very much for being here with us today. And I leave you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. So I hope that the structure of the next hour and a half or hour and a quarter is not a surprise to you, so that you've had the chance in particular to review the videos with the main slides of the lecture, because the plan is not to go through those, but to then try to apply some of those concepts to a case study that we are going to do interactively together, as Valerie has just said. So the first part typically is where we I ask you whether you have any questions coming up from the video that hopefully you have had the chance to review. If there is anything that is unclear or doesn't sound right, or that you would want to discuss or extend. Now, I realize that is a bit of a difficult way to start, because you're cold, but that may help then in the discussion of the case study. So let me give the floor to you and ask whether you found everything relatively clear in the video, or you have questions, or there is anything that you would like to discuss, or even any comments that you would like to have as a
Just some input from my side. I'm terribly sorry, but I didn't have the time to watch the videos, so I'm really sorry for that. But had a huge workload over this Easter break. Thank you for your understanding.
Yeah, no, understood. It happens. The only thing is that there is and the case study and all of it can be done in essence without having seen the video. The only thing is that then maybe it becomes a little bit more difficult for me to help you follow up on that. But it's obviously entirely up to you. I do understand that work always takes precedence and can be intense. Is there anybody who has any comment or questions or remarks based on those videos, or should we move on to discussing the case study? or actually first discussing amongst yourself the case study and then discussing all together the case studies.
Yes, I would like just to ask about just to know if there were any updates on the decisions by the European Commission, because I remember that in one of the videos, most of the decisions involving, I think, abusive behaviors were concluded with remedies. So if there were any updates on that, any condemnations of companies based on this. And also after, if you could comment a little bit more on the test for the essential facilities, I would also appreciate that.
Okay, those are both very important questions. So as to your question, yes, there have been a few cases that are not necessarily covered in the videos. The reason for that is because there was an initial round of cases around the period, I'll say 2008 to 2014, which was a big period of antitrust activity. Then there was a little bit more of a lull, but lately the European Commission has started reinvestigating the industry more vigorously. There are only 3 decisions that are not discussed in the videos. And the reality is that most of them are the same kind of behavior of one of the cases discussed there, and that is one of the main reasons why they have it. Although, you know, I could have at least noted them, and maybe I should have. The 3 decisions are BEH Gas, that is the Bulgarian competition, the Bulgarian incumbent gas decision, and that is essentially a refusal to supply or refusal to grant access to the gas network, which is fairly similar to the cases discussed on the slides, like the E.ON case, the RW case, and although a little bit different from the case study that we are going to do now, which is also based on a case. That is the first decision that is uncovered there. That decision came with a prohibition decision and is under appeal at the General Court. Although it's been under appeal since 2019, yet we don't have the General Court decision. So I was hoping to wait until that decision to include a fuller discussion of that case. But it is essentially all about refusal to supply access to the transmission network, essentially in gas. The second one is also a gas decision, and it's a Romanian gas interconnection decision. Transgas is the company involved. That is a more recent decision. The decision is in 2020. That is also a prohibition. Sorry, let me double check. I wasn't, no, that's a commitment decision. It's an Article 9 decision. And that is a case that is fairly similar in some aspects to the case study that we're going to do. So because also there are issues that are similar, I won't spoiler the point of the case study, but if you perhaps remind me after we discuss it so that we can draw the parallels. So that's the other decision. And the final decision is also a commitment decision through on the electricity market in this case, and it was the interconnector between Denmark and Germany, and that is a decision that I find it a little bit. It's also very similar to all of the cases that I discuss in the video, because essentially the argument is that the owner of the interconnector, TenneT is the name of the company, of the interconnector between Denmark and Germany, essentially rather than refuse, limited the access of electricity coming from Denmark into Germany. Now, that is an interesting decision, and maybe I should have included it, because from an economic perspective, the interesting thing is that it's not clear what would have been the interest of this company, TenneT, which is a transport system operator, which is independent from the generator of electricity in Germany, to prevent import of electricity from Denmark to Germany, given that they are not producing electricity themselves. And therefore, the interesting part of that commitment decision is that the Commission analysis is a little surprising in that it doesn't get into the question of why would a transport operator choose to limit the amount of electricity entering a country if it's not producing electricity itself. It's not in its interest. And if there isn't a theory of harm there, might not be the case that the technical justification advanced, although according to the Commission, somewhat half-heartedly by the company, about the technical reason why wouldn't be able to allow the full capacity of the interconnector to be used for electricity coming from the Nordics into Germany, why those aren't actually good justification, given that it wouldn't have had a clear commercial rationale for keeping, if you want, the Nordic generated electricity out. So these are the three cases. There are, however, a number of investigations open, which we don't know very much about, except the if you want, the press release. One is on the Greek wholesale electricity market, where the Commission is investigating the, if you want, the incumbent company PPPC, possibly for having bid below cost in certain wholesale procurement bids. And so it's a predatory pricing kind of theory. That is not a theory that has been used widely in the past cases that are discussed in the video, because those are mostly cases about, if you want, a refusal to supply and access to essential facility. Those are the typical cases. Another one on the Romanian gas wholesale market, which also, if I'm not mistaken, is about well, I think, sorry, that is a dawn raid, which could be either an Article 101, therefore sort of collusion investigation, or Article 102 investigation. The Commission hasn't made its decision yet, so it's very early to talk about it. There is an investigation of Qatar Gas, for which is a producer of gas in Qatar, obviously, for their long-term supply contract of liquefied natural gas, LNG, to Europe, and whether those contracts contain destination clause. It's something that is discussed in the video, so it's a very similar case to the destination clause cases in there. And then I think there is a one investigation against, I think, electricity exchange, EPEX spot market, about, again, a refusal to supply certain contracts to compete to customers of competing exchanges. But again, we don't know very much of that investigation. And then from the press, we know that the European Commission is also investigating whether the recent increase end of February 2022, there was already an increase in gas prices in Europe, were potentially due to a reduction of supply by Gazprom. and that is the other investigation that is ongoing. So there are a number of investigations, but there are only 3 new decisions, to summarize the point. On the investigation ongoing, we don't know very much. On the 3 decision, 2 are very similar to the one discussed in the video. One is, or in the case study, one is a little bit peculiar, but this is all there is to update. So that was your first question, and sorry that it took long, but there were some update. The second one, on the test on an essential facility, is there a particular point that you want me to cover, or is it in general the whole test that you're interested? And in particular, I think that then, you know, I could share that slide and go through it if that's what you were suggesting, but I don't want to take a lot of time if that is not what you had in mind.
No, it's nothing specific. It's just like a general overview of how it works.
Yes. Okay, so let me do it relatively quickly. Let me see if I can do it here by sharing. You should be seeing at this point, if I share the right thing, a single slide with a test for essential facility and you know, I think it's called the Chevron graphics, that is a number of arrows. So the test for essential facility is a test that to some extent comes from a number of cases that have nothing to do with energy. Oscar Bronner is the main case where it was initially initiated and then has been developed in further points. It is, however, an important test for network markets, and in particular for, if you want, the energy markets, because a lot of the cases that we've seen are cases where the dominant or incumbent company is controlling an essential facility that is you know, something that cannot easily be replicated. So what is the test? Essentially to determine whether there is a issue or an abuse of dominance due to the refusal of an essential facility. The first part is obviously that there needs to be a refusal to deal or a refusal to grant access to the essential facility. This refusal could either be an outright refusal, you know, answering that there is, usually for technical reasons, the justification, no ability for someone to access, for instance, a gas transmission system or electricity transmission system, although, you know, there are questions as to whether these tests can be these days used for digital platforms and all sorts of other potential essential facility. The second part, or it could be a constructive refusal to deal, which means, yes, you can access the essential facility, but at a lot of terms and conditions which are uncommercial or uneconomic for the company seeking access. That would still be considered the refusal to supply. Then there is a need that creates an effect in a secondary market. That is basically a concept that there is an ability of the dominant supplier to use the essential facility to protect or to leverage its market power in a secondary market. The third condition is that the input, and this is the core, if you want, of the essential facility test, is that the essential facility has to be essential. What does it mean to be essential? It means that there should be no viable alternative to the facility, and that cannot be replicated by someone similarly sized or in a similar position. This is often the case of transmission networks, for instance, or of certain, sometimes it's been used for ports, because you cannot build a port anywhere on the coast. There are particular places where you can do it, and the same, or because building a new port, building a new railway line, building a new gas transmission system, or new electricity grid is just, or telecom network, fixed network is just commercially not viable. And therefore it has been constructed once, typically under condition of monopoly, and it cannot be replicated again. And this is the core of, from an economic perspective, of the identification of an essential facility. Another part of the test, and is one that is seen as pretty strict by competition authorities, is then, you have an abuse in preventing access to an essential facility only if you essentially, if that refusal to provide access eliminates competition from the market, which means that excludes all or most competitors, is not enough to put them at a competitive disadvantage. And that is one, and these two characteristics together, well, maybe also the third, so let me introduce a third one together again, which is the new product that is often, because these cases were not created in electricity or in energy, or in places where the facility was clearly essential. One additional reason that the case law highlights as an anti-competitive effect, that is a necessary part to find an abuse in terms of prohibiting access to the essential facility, is that this refusal to supply prevents the supply of a new product. And that you can find is especially relevant for IP, the case that outlines this, well, comes up with this condition and now lies in the best is McGill, which is a case about TV schedules in newspapers. But basically the idea there is that the dominant player holding the essential facility not only is prohibiting other people from operating it, but that prohibition prevents the emergence of a new product because the incumbent is not offering the product. Now, that is something that in energy, for instance, would be difficult to use. And then there is the last part about objective justification, that is the incumbent cannot justify the lack of providing access because there is incapacity, because who's ever asking for access is not creditworthy, or there are safety consideration. Now, typically the European Commission tries to stay away from defining anything as an essential facility, because it sees this combination of conditions as very, very strict and very difficult to meet them all at once in one place. For instance, the new product, which is in McGill and others, the Commission would have to say that it doesn't apply in areas, for instance, like energy. But while the essentiality is usually easily ticked for certain cases, is not easily ticked for all of them. And we can see that, for instance, if you have a storage facility for gas, or a particular generating plant, they may not be essential because there may be others around. And it's difficult also to tick the box of full elimination of competition. Because of this reason, most of the cases that the Commission has done, from an economic perspective, look like essential facility cases, but in practice, they have not been run as such, because the Commission sees essential facility as a very difficult hurdle to clear. So I hope that this was what you were after. Okay. Yes. Are there any other questions, comments, reflections? If not, oh, sorry.
Yeah, Professor, I have a question. I would like to know whether the SEP, the standard essential patent, is a kind of essential facility.
Sorry, the audio wasn't great, so I didn't hear. What is the part that would be part of the essential facility? Could you ask?
SEP, the standard essential patent.
Oh, SEP. Okay, yes, standard essential patents. Whether those could be considered essential facilities? That's a very good question. So the European Commission has not, in general, defined the standard essential facilities, standard essential patents as essential facilities. Again, this is because it finds the test very strict. The way the Commission has normally done it, and there are a couple of cases which I'm sure you may be familiar with. One is Apple Motorola and Apple Samsung. There are two decisions by the Commission, and there are also there is the Huawei decision by the European Court of Justice, of course, is that to define the market very narrowly. So the Commission defines the relevant market as the market for a standard essential patent family, or to be more precise, for the technologies protected by a standard essential patent family. Once you have that narrow market definition, you end up with a market where the patent holder has 100% of the market. That is already enough, usually, for the Commission to say it's dominant, because there is a case law that says that when market shares approach 70, 80%, usually someone is dominant unless there are exceptional circumstances. And so then it goes through some discussion as to whether the licensor or the prospective licensee, the one that wants to get a license to the essential facility, as a countervailing buyer power. And the Commission has looked at it in those cases, has always said, yes, you can have some countervailing buyer power, but only if you have a big enough standard essential patent portfolio yourself as a prospective licensee that the licensor needs access to, because then you're in the symmetric position. If, however, the licensor is, for instance, a non-practicing entity that doesn't need to get the license to anybody else's portfolio, then nobody can be in a countervailing market power position. And so on that basis, it considers then that having a valid standard essential patent confers dominance on the patent holder, but it doesn't call it an essential facility, because it thinks that it's enough to call it dominant, and to say that it's an essential facility requires to tick these more boxes, and that they stay away from it as much as they can. Okay. Any other questions? Then, and maybe, we have if we're lucky, we have 5 minutes at the end, if anything comes in mind. Then I would suggest the following. Why don't we break you down into groups? I think that maybe, Valerie, if you can make 3 groups, if that's possible. Then you should, hopefully you've read the case study, otherwise you should read it quickly and discuss amongst yourself, and try to answer the 3 questions at the bottom. The 3 questions are: did the alleged dominant companies here, it's ENI, did the behavior violate competition law, or in particular Article 102? How would you try to assess the behavior to determine, to get that answer, and then which type of test will apply? To be honest, I would suggest that you start from the bottom and you work way up. If you apply the test, then you know how you would assess the behavior, and if you then apply that test and you assess the behavior, then you can answer the first question. But it's you can answer it whichever way you want. So we'll give you 20 minutes, and then you know, at 1:25, it would be great if you had selected one of you who can make a short presentation, I mean, just verbally like this, of 2 or 3 minutes, and tell us what your group thinks. Okay.
Yes. Are there
Sure.
any question, any last question? Because I'm creating the groups. No. Okay, let's go.
Okay, I haven't joined the room that you
No,
gave
no,
me.
of course, Lorenzo. No, stay here with me. No
All right.
problem. And we will make them come back. I will do that at 25.
Perfect.
Yes. Thank you.
Do you mind if I turn my camera off and I go and get a coffee?
No, of course, go ahead.
Thank you, Valerie. The points of the debate, as opposed to the conclusion. You may not have a full conclusion on everything, but maybe you could say what you were discussing as part of it.
Okay, so I will start, and if Laura or Daniel has something to add. We were mainly at the point first to know if these terminals are in fact essential facilities. I think the second point was to see how true it is for ENI to say that it does not have capacity, because we understand that this ship or pay clause, I mean, you does not necessarily use the capacity, although you have to pay for it, but it may represent that you have spare capacity, so you would be able to provide the importers what they want. And the second, the volume asked of 6 BCM, that we believe they have this volume to provide. So, and what we could, I think, discuss here was that the test would be to see if this is an essential facility, because we were having some doubts about the other tests, the PSI and the RSI, because we understood that they were applicable when we were talking about companies with small shares, but which behaviors could affect the market. But here, mainly ENI, it has large, huge market shares in the gas market. So we were mainly discussing these points.
Okay, so can I ask you on the first point, that is this essential facility, were you discussing the what was an essential facility? Those particular 2 northern pipelines where the importers have asked capacity, or were you discussing in general all the importing infrastructure into Italy, which is the one, if you want, in figure 1, which included more stuff, or were you discussing even broader? So what was the, if you want, the relevant market that you were focusing on implicitly?
At least for me, I think we were looking at the terminals itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, which in this case, it would be, if you look at figure 1, it would be the 2 pipelines that come from the north into Italy. So the one named TAG in blue on the right, and the one named Temp Transit Gas is the same pipeline, but has 2 bits, the one in red and the one in blue. These are the ones where there was the refusal, right? Is that what you were focusing on? Okay. So the ship or pay point, let me see if I understood. You were wondering whether that was a valid defense, a valid justification for providing. Okay, understood. And then the PSI RSI, let me ask you, was that in answer to the question, what type of test would you apply, or was it more generally?
Yes, if they would be applicable tests to look to this specific case.
Okay, on this point, okay. Now let me ask then, first of all, your colleagues, given that there was a debate in the first group as to whether, in your group, whether they have anything to add or whether we should go to the other groups. I take silence as a sign that there wasn't anything to add. So who's the spokesperson for the second group?
What's the second group?
I don't know, for another group, let's say.
It's Charlotte, Kyriakos, Sonia, or Vivian. So you are group 3, Tim.
Yes,
Natalie?
hello. I'm not sure I can add something useful to the discussion. We mainly discussed with my colleagues the fact that the refusal of Eni not to provide its network is not objective because it has booked, we think, its capacity, but this capacity is not in the reality is available. It may be available in reality, but I'm not that sure that this is the answer, if this is useful.
And why do you say that it may be available in reality? So you're saying that the fact that it's contracted, it may not mean that it is used? Is that what you're saying?
Pardon, could you repeat, please?
Sorry, yes, you say that it's not objective, or it may not be objective because the capacity may actually be available. So are you saying that the justification of Eni that it was contracted through this ship or pay contract doesn't mean that if there is a contract for use, that it is actually used? Was that the point that you were making for why it wasn't objective?
Yes,
or was it a different one?
yes, this is that's what I'm saying, is that if it's not used in reality, despite the contract, that the refusal is not objective.
Okay. And was there a consideration for, was there any other data there that suggested that it wasn't used? Or it was just you were just thinking that it may not be, we don't know, right? Is that what you were saying? Or were you, sorry, let me ask the question more clearly. Were you saying that we don't know whether it was used and therefore whether it was available? Or were you saying that it was an excuse because it was actually available? That you have evidence in the case study that it was available?
I think we didn't go in such depth with my colleagues in our discussion, so I'm not sure. I believe that it's not. We don't know if it is actually available.
Okay.
There may be some evidence within the case study that indicate that it is available, but I'm not sure which are, because we didn't discuss it.
Okay, understood. Okay, so let me then, anything else from your group?
No, thank you very much. I'm not sure I added something useful.
No, it's part, and I think that also this is something that also the first group was focusing on. So now, what does the third group think?
Well, maybe we also had a very close debate about that. We actually assumed a little bit that the capacity would have been there, or at least if the capacity would not have been there, that INI could have at least tried to extend their capacity. Maybe to address a point that was during what group number 2 explained. I mean, as we see in figure number 3, at mid 2008, between July and September, there has been a slight decrease in the TTF and the PSV, which could be an incentive for the fact that there was more offer than demand. So that could be, in theory, used as some kind of evidence that, in theory, there would have been capacity that INI could have offered to the companies that were requesting it. I mean, as figure 3 shows as well, is that the market is actually very volatile, meaning that there are probably some situations where not all of the capacity is being used. Otherwise, it would be more likely that the price would be more stable. As it comes to some theory of harms, in this case, we thought about probably most important, refusal to deal, which would be breach of 102, because INI is, according to European standards, dominant in the market with considerably more than 30%. We also thought about an idea that has recently given more attention to, which is self-preferencing, because as I understood the situation, any made most of its capacity available to their own sub-company. It is still, in my opinion, it's still a bit difficult to categorize self-preferencing under the cases mentioned in 102. It is, however, we found some papers about a few people mentioning that those refusal cases could also be framed under 102A discrimination if they would apply the similar conditions to several market players, meaning that they would preference their own sub-company and then have no capacity available anymore for other companies. I mean, they would of course also require that there might be some additional capacity available. Apart from that, our main concern would be also, or one of our main incentives to say that INI actually abused their position here would be that they might not have even tried to extend their capacity. I mean, we don't have too much information about that, but if you would assume that they are working on their capacity limits and then that they are somehow legally bound by the contract that they have with their sub-companies, then you would at least feel some obligation to investigate if there are cost-efficient possibilities to at least make a little bit more capacity available to other companies that are demanding. However, if I would be defending INI in this case, you could also argue that whatever they might have done, the prices are still considerably below the prices, for example, in Northern Europe. So you could argue that there was no harm to the consumer. On the other hand, we don't have too much information about the spread that INI has between their purchasing costs and their own fixed costs, which would form the wholesale price. So there would be something that would have still to be discussed if they would want to defend themselves by saying whatever we did, it was no disadvantage to the consumer. But yeah, that were mainly our subjects of our discussion in this case. I don't know, if Andrea, if you guys still want to add something, then I'm grateful for that as well.
No, I think that covers it well.
Okay, so let me give you in 2 minutes. I think you all covered the right points, but let me give you in 2 minutes a couple of points on the case study. So I think that it is probably correct to focus on these 2 pipelines as the relevant market, because essentially the idea is that there is a lot of gas that one can procure in Central Europe, not so much in Northern Africa, and therefore in order to enter the Italian market, these are the two main ports of interest. There is a question as to whether also gas could come through GNL, and therefore whether those altogether would be the relevant market. It would make a difference because while Eni controls this and controls this, it doesn't control this. Having said that, if you calculate the market share, it's probably going to be dominant there. However, the question is then whether it would be essential, because the entrants could ask for access at this point, which is not controlled by Eni. So there is a first question to ask yourself if you want to build a coherent case, which market are we looking around? But most likely you're going to find that Eni was dominant on the relevant market. Then I think there are 2 points to note. All of this is noting that there was significant expectation of an increase in new import capacity. All of these green lines were what other people other than Eni were proposing as potential projects. Now, there was uncertainty, as we note here, on those projects, but those were projects that were foreseen. For the moment, let's park this point. A point that is important is that the complaint comes in 2008, and the entrants were asking, this is where it says, the entrants were asking for 6 BCM of import capacity on the 2 northern pipelines. Now, we don't know whether the full pipelines were used, but we know that there was possibly some capacity surplus, but not in maximum safety conditions, meaning that there is an argument, at least on the Eni side, to say, I cannot give you 6 BCM, because if you look at the capacity surplus that wasn't being used, it wasn't clear that 6 was possible. Now, the European Commission brought this case, and this is a case that you can read, and it had 2 parts. One was refusal to give access to the capacity, and there were some discussion about whether Eni was right or not in saying that there wasn't capacity. It's quite technical, because the main allegation of the Commission is that Eni gave access to the capacity, but in a way that kind of degrades the capacity. If you've seen the video they had done before on cases, saying that rather than committing to capacity for the long term, they were giving capacity kind of for the next 3 months, and they were only giving it a month in advance, and you couldn't plan a business around it. But that could have been a justification in that there were only 2 BCM in maximum safety condition. However, then the shippers said, okay, if you don't have capacity, then why don't you invest to increase the capacity? And that is the point you were highlighting now, Till. That is the abuse of dominance that is more peculiar and more interesting from an economic perspective. Because one thing is to refuse access to something that existing. The capacity is there, and you're telling, I'm not giving it to you, I'd rather not use it. It's a difficult thing to justify. You can have some objective justification, as I said, the credit worthiness of the people, the capacity, some contractual safety, some contractual reason, but it's more difficult to justify because it says, I have it, I'd rather not use it than give it to you. One thing is to say, I have to spend billions building something because you want it. That is the more difficult thing to abuse. Now, what the Commission needs typically to show there, and I mentioned at the very beginning that one of the newer case is the Transgas case in Romania, where the Commission has come up with the same theory of harm, is to say there's only one investor that can possibly provide this capacity. Now, in Romania, for Transgas, is because it's capacity at the interconnector, and they have the pipeline, they have the system on the Romanian side. Nobody else has the system on the Romanian side. Nobody else has the interconnector. The question is the interconnector capacity. I can see why the Commission is saying that you know, the only person providing this extra capacity can only be Transgas in that case. In this case, given how many projects there were, both for regasifiers and pipelines from parties other than Eni, is a little bit more difficult to say why Eni would have been the one to increase the capacity at the pipeline. Now, the Commission had an argument and a concern. It was that it's much easier to expand capacity at existing pipelines than build a new one. And therefore, they would have needed to show that essentially there is an essential investor. Eni was the only one who could have reasonably provided the extra capacity, and that there was a need for the extra capacity. And this is, I think, where this information, table 6, goes, because essentially what this shows is that there was no expectation that there would have been a need for Eni to invest in the long term, because while capacity was tight in 2008 and was tight in 2009, the year after that, it was clear that on the basis of all these planned, or some of these planned, this was, by the way, forecast by the national regulator. It wasn't, you know, the parties or Eni forecast, that there would be enough excess capacity. If you see these numbers start growing a lot after 2010, and therefore the question is, would have been rational for Eni to spend few hundred millions or billions to expand capacity given all this expansion that was there? So that was a case that was an interesting one, but the Commission had a point, and this is a confusing slide, and let me tell you how to interpret it. This was, the blue is the price in Italy, the red is the price in Northern Europe, and it goes up and down because the price of gas goes up and down, as we see in this time. Back then, because it was indexed to oil, today for other reasons, but it still goes up and down. The ups and downs are very similar in Northern Europe and in Italy, but there is a premium in Italy. The price of gas in Italy was always higher than in Northern Europe. And the Commission was saying, and this is because Eni doesn't allow people to ship gas from Northern Europe into Italy this way. So it had some evidence of effects, potentially, but where the Commission theory of harm potentially was a little bit weaker, was in this abuse of dominance for refusal to invest. Because while a refusal to supply is a very classical, refusal to invest has a lot of other consideration, like if someone else is investing, why should I as the dominant company? Is it commercially rational to invest if other people are investing? There isn't anything that is being unused, so you have to actually demonstrate that I would commercially invest. And that's why the question here of the test that would apply, you'll see in the video, is the so-called test for a independent system operator. The Commission essentially said, if you, Eni, only were operating the pipelines and didn't have another interest to control the market in Italy because you only had the pipeline, would you have done it? If the answer is yes, then the fact that you're not doing it means that you're protecting your monopoly in Italy, and therefore it's an abuse of dominance. That is potentially a good test to try and differentiate this, and it has some, and it is a test that can be used. I liked your reference to self-referencing, but that's a bigger discussion that I'm afraid we don't have the time to make at the moment. So I've already eaten up almost all of your break, for which I do apologize. But if you have questions or comments, I'll send you a couple of slides on this case study, not explaining the case study, but explaining the test, the case that the commission did, and these points, so you can have it for your reference. But if you have any questions, here I am.
Well, thanks a lot for a very, very thorough explanation. I just maybe quickly wanted to use the chance to ask something that was actually bothering me a bit, because we've recently seen that crazy ups in the energy market prices, and basically what even the Federal Cartel Office in Germany gave as a theory of explanation was that at that point where the market price for benzene and diesel that was sold to the end consumers detached from the crude oil stock price, there was actually they argued that could have on the one hand been because there would be some kind of collusion, but they also said that could have been a situation where all companies would remain in some kind of status quo bias, where they would just as soon as none of their competitors would take an incentive to lower the price, also not lower the prices themselves, which would lead us again to the question if some kind of tacit collusion situation should be punishable under 101 TFEU. Well, do you find it convincing that there might have been the situation in that case, and would you, as a result for that, then see some kind of holes in the current frameworks where the lawmakers should maybe adapt?
Okay, that's an interesting one. There is a big literature. So on petrol, diesel and petrol, there is a big economic literature that always shows a particular behavior of prices. And it's not only in Germany, or it's in every country. In fact, it's also in the US. What it shows is that when the price of oil goes up, price of petrol and diesel follows and goes up together. When the price of oil comes down, the price of oil, of petrol and diesel doesn't come up as quickly. It comes out, but much slower. The literature is called rockets and feathers. And that's because of the initial paper that found that, it says that petrol price goes up like a rocket and comes down like a feather. That is a known economic fact of how petrol market works. There has always been a discussion. Is it because petrol company collude, or is it a natural oligopolistic competition of the market? And that is a very difficult thing to answer. In the case law, there is no answer, because the two cases that have nothing to do with petrol that discuss the difference between tacit collusion, because there is no formal agreement here, typically, between tacit collusion and oligopolistic interaction, which is not illegal, are dye stuff and wood pulp. And they came up with two completely different conclusions. And since then, the commission has stayed away completely from looking at tacit collusion, which is not coming from agreement or exchange of information. Now, that might change now that the European Commission has a bit of a drought of cartel cases because there is no leniency. There are no leniency application anymore, and so it may change and revive that. But the reality is that it is very difficult from a legal perspective, but also an economic perspective, to draw a clear line between oligopolistic competition and tacit collusion. In reality, there are a lot of explanation of that behavior that go towards oligopolistic competition, and the fact that, you know, there is no incentive to be the first one to cut the price of gas, and it's for various economic reasons. So there are a lot of explanations that suggest to me that unless the Bundeskartellamt finds some evidence of agreement or concerted practice or information exchange, is a very difficult case to bring.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. Is there any other question before we close the lecture? No? 1, 2, 3. Okay. So perfect. Thank you, Lorenzo, for joining us.
Thank you very much for participating, and sorry for having eaten entirely your break. Apologies for that.
No, we'll do a break. I asked Carol, and so hi, Carol, she's here. And she said that we can do a break of 15 minutes. So you will be all relieved
Okay.
for a few. Please do not forget, for those who haven't watched the videos, to watch it over the weekend. Thank you. And thank you, Lorenzo. For the students, we will meet at 3:15, if that's all right. Thank you. See you in a few minutes. Bye, Lorenzo. Have a good weekend. Bye. Carole.
Oui.
Voilà. Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Voilà, je ne sais pas si vous voulez partager vos slides. Normalement, c'est possible. En dessous, il y a un onglet Share the screen. Et si ça ne va pas, je le ferai, aucun problème.
Il y a juste que je me demande si pour le moment c'est possible, parce que je regarde. Hein. Ah oui, non, c'est bon.
Hello everyone, can you please join us again for the last session? Can open your video again so we can see you and say hello to Carol.
Hey, hello, hi everyone.
Hello.
Some familiar faces as well, that's good to see.
So as I explained in the beginning of the lecture today, this session will be 2-hour lecture, and will present the competition laws regulation in the railway sector. And for the moment, I didn't say that, but Karol Maxkowicz is working at Covington, so in the Brussels office. Karol, the floor is yours. You can start whenever you want. Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Valérie. And hi, everyone. So I will propose that we embark on a journey across a very old industry, the railways. This industry is probably also considered now increasingly as an industry of the future, given the climate change challenges. And also you will see that there are some developments. More recently, On the competition law front, we can see that the market becomes a bit more dynamic, although I must say it is less topical than the previous subject that you have examined today. But let us start. I would also suggest that you just stop me whenever you want to raise a question, make a remark, or if something is unclear. And let us make this session as interactive as possible. So let us see what we are going to cover today. The railways really present some specific features that we will also examine together, and which led basically to specific legal rules adopted at EU level that translated in a progressive liberalization of the sector, in the sense that there is an opening up of the railway markets, which is progressive and not yet completed, and accompanied with a lot of rules, regulation, contrary to the concept of deregulation that we often also hear. It is here absolutely not the case. The liberalization is accompanied with a lot of rules that we are also going to examine, at least from an economic point of view, not necessarily what relates to safety and interoperability. And then we will also have a look at how competition law helped the liberalization process before concluding. So let's see what are the specificities of the railways. Well, as I mentioned, it's an old industry that played a major role in the industrial revolution to transport goods, and also in the advent of the EU freedom later in the 20th century. In the transportation of goods, but also of people, mass transportation of people. It is really characterized by a national feature. It is important for national government. It also employs a lot of people. It is fragmented. Across the EU, you would find various types of infrastructures with different gauges, different traction current also. And this really means that crossing borders is not so evident with the railways. There are a lot of technical barriers to entry in the sector. The infrastructure and the services were initially integrated in a public monopoly. This is the case in almost all the EU countries, and these industries have been generally heavily indebted. The infrastructure, the core infrastructure really presents features of natural monopoly. It is difficult to replicate, it is fixed, it costs a lot, and as already mentioned, it is very fragmented. And a last interesting point that really characterizes the railway transport sector, it is very small modal share compared to other modes of transport. If you look at the transportation of passengers, it only represents approximately 7% of the market. For freight, for the transportation of goods, it's a little bit better, but still it's quite low if you compare to other modes of transport, with only 2.6% of the market share. Also, the railways are said to be heavily subsidized, both for the infrastructures as for the public service. Here you will see the references to PSO, which means public service obligations, as well as for the pensions. As you may know, most of a lot of workers in the railway sector may still be pertaining to the state, being civil servants, and their pension costs are higher than in other potentially sectors. However, this picture shows indeed approximately 8% of EU GDP spent on the railways, but you should keep in mind that most railway undertakings would criticize the fact that member states do not invest sufficiently in the infrastructure, that the infrastructure is not well maintained and not yet sufficiently developed to ensure that there is a lot of railway services provided on the infrastructure. So this shows indeed quite a lot of expenses from the state to the sector, but please keep in mind that this is considered not to be sufficient by many. So that was it for sketching the context and describing the specificities of the railway sector. And this may explain what we have seen now, may explain why there are specific rules applicable to the sector. As you may know, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union contains a specific title dealing with transport. This title applies fully to land transport and in particular to railways. And therefore, given this specific title in the treaty, there were a lot of discussions early on whether or not this sector would also be subject to the other rules of the treaty. In a case relating to the maritime sector, the French Seaman case, which is now a bit old because it was rendered in the 70s, the Court of Justice recalled the universality principle of the treaty. The general treaty rules apply to any sector covered by the treaty, also to the transport sector, unless there are express exemption to these rules. And this is the case of Article 58 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which provides that the freedom to provide services in the transport sector is not governed by the chapter on services, but on the title, it's governed by the title on transport. However, in the transport case decided in the 80s, the court also mentioned and recalled that although there is a specific rule relating to the transport sector, the result of the application of these rules should be the same as for the general treaty rules, namely that there should be the freedom of services guaranteed also for the railway sector, the land transport sector. However, the only difference that this specific provision of the treaty induces is that the government, the governments, the council may decide on the means and the pace to open up the services, the railway services to competition, to allow the freedom of services. And as a matter of law, of course, in the Ashes case, again in the 80s, the court recorded also that the general competition rules are applicable to the transport sector. So we see there is a specific title in the treaty. However, in principle, the general treaty rules are also applicable to the transport sector, except where there is an express exemption, which is the case for the freedom of services. This translated also in specific rules, specific regulations adopted on the basis of the treaty regarding specifically the railways. We have Directive 2012/34 on the Single European Railway Area, which is a directive that had been recast also in 2012 and then amended in 2016 with the fourth railway package. There are several technical directives dealing with safety issues and interoperability. There are also specific rules for antitrust. I mentioned here Regulation 169 of 2009, which relates specifically to railways and the possibility to conclude technical agreements. Of course, Regulation 1 of 2003 also apply to the sector, and some particular rules for state aid control, where the public service obligations are quite important and dealt with in Regulation 1370 of 2007. There are also some specific rules in the treaty that would apply above the more general treaty rules if they deal with the coordination of transport and the public service obligations, and there are specific guidelines dealing with the railway sector. These guidelines are currently under revision by the Commission and should be modified by, I think, the last quarter of 2023. So we have seen that the sector presents some specific features, which has also led to some specific rules being provided for in the treaty and in secondary legislation at European level. And that all translated in a progressive liberalization of the sector. So with the first railway package, the first and second railway package, the European Union had identified basically a contestable segment for the railways, being the rail transport services, where the European Union considered that there would be the possibility to introduce competition in these services, and and deviate from the monopolies that were existing. And therefore, it was decided to open up the rail transport services, whereas the infrastructure, the management of the core infrastructure on which the trains are running, would remain a monopoly. And as we have seen, it's already a natural monopoly, but it can also be a legal monopoly under the EU rules on railway. The opening up of railways is really under the supervision of the regulatory body that is to be set up in each EU member state, and which has to be independent from the state and from any entity active on either the infrastructure or the railway transport service market. And the opening up has been progressive on the rail transport services. You will see that depending on the instruments, some services, more and more services had been opened up to competition. And in the last column, you see also when this opening up is to be due. And we can see that the latest phase of liberalization is not yet completed, because it will be in December 2023. So based on the earlier directive, initially in the 90s, it was provided that railway undertakings could form a group together to provide first combined transport in order to access the member states where the constituent undertakings are established, and to transit also through these member states. These were called international groupings, and interestingly, it really prompted a model of co-contracting, where the undertakings, the railway undertakings, would work together to provide services. With the first railway package, the competition for international freight services on a specific network, the Trans-European Rail Freight Network, was to be opened up by 2003. With the second railway package, this had been expanded to international freight services on the whole network, and then to domestic freight services that are now open up to competition since 2007. So it's more than, it's approximately 15 years that freight services are fully opened up to competition. However, for passengers, it is not yet fully opened up to competition, because a first wave with the third railway package imposed the possibility for railway undertakings to be able to provide international passenger services by 2010. And the fourth railway package, the latest one adopted, provides for competition in the market, with the opening up of domestic passenger transport services in a commercial way by December 2020. So it's also very recent. And in parallel, the possibility or the obligation for authorities to put public service contracts at competition. So the competition for the market has to be organized by December 2023. However, and there again, I think it's important also to stress that if a public service contract is awarded before December 2023, it could last for 10 years. So you can also see that there might be some public service contracts close to competition until 2033. And this is this might be the case in several member states. Also, for you to understand how these two models of opening up of domestic passenger services for commercial services might coexist with public service contracts. It is said that across the EU, at least 50% of passenger services, domestic passenger services, are under public service contracts. And in some countries, like for instance in Belgium, which is a small and very dense network, almost all, if not all, the network is subject to a public service contract. Which brings me to the next slide, and you see with the coexistence of these two possibilities, namely competition in the market and competition for the market, or competition in the market for commercial services and public service contracts where there might be exclusive rights granted to the public service operator. There had been a long discussion among the EU member states, and it was eventually decided that the opening up of services in open access, as we say, the competition in the market, that the regulatory body could possibly limit or deny the right of access to a network where the exercise of such open access right would compromise the economic equilibrium of a public service contract. So that means that if the commercial service in open access may have an impact, a negative impact on the public service, for instance, by cherry picking the revenues on more profitable lines comprised into a public service contract, and therefore we request more subsidies basically for the public service provider, or better allocation of the revenues into this public service contract. The regulatory body could even limit the right for such open access, for such commercial railway service, if it compromises or may compromise the economic equilibrium of the public service contract. This rationale, maybe you have seen it in other courses, comes from the Corbeau case. The idea is really to avoid cherry picking. It's really to allow the public service provider to cross-subsidize internally between the services that might be less profitable and the services that might be more profitable within the public service contract. In the Corbeau case, if you have seen it in another class, You will remember that the Corbeau case related to a postal operator which wanted to provide services in a city where the network is relatively dense. And the Belgian La Poste at the time, now bpost, basically considered that it was contrary to its exclusive rights to have competition in such city, because then the private operator was reaping off the profits of these services, whereas La Poste had to also provide services in remote areas where it was more costly to provide the service. It was also, in that case, a question of whether or not La Poste was abusing its dominant position by refusing the possibility for this other operator to enter the market, and it was considered that, however, according to 106 paragraph 2 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, such application of competition law may not be contrary to cannot compromise the provision of a public service. I don't know if this is clear, but I think it's important to understand how both type of services can coexist in the railway sector, and in particular for passenger services. The legislation also provides for the possibility to levy a charge on the railway operators that would operate their services in open access to finance then the public service obligations. But at my knowledge, this is not so much used. This possibility is not so much used. So we have seen that the railways present some specific features that also call for specific rules that have led to a progressive liberalization of the sector. Now, let us see how ex-ante regulation has managed or is managing to introduce competition in the rail transport markets. So there are several types of remedies that can be thought of upfront, ex ante, and these are either working on the structures of the market or on the behavior of the market players. And there are some structural rules that are applicable in the railway sector. Basically, as in other regulated network industries, the idea to have some separation between the infrastructure and the service providers is also implemented into the sector, where the legislator had finally retained the functional vertical separation between the infrastructure and transport services. Infrastructure managers who basically manage the tracks, the signaling, which allow also the train to operate on the network, must have separate accounts from railway undertakings. Their functions relating to the management of the infrastructure towards the railway undertakings, namely the allocation of the capacity on the network, as well as the pricing thereof, should be independent. It should be organized in an independent way from the railway undertakings. And the legislation also provides for the possibility to remain, to keep vertically integrated structures, but then requires reinforced independence conditions. Across the EU, there are some important undertakings that are still vertically integrated, and namely SNCF in France and Deutsche Bahn in Germany are integrated, vertically integrated with a model of holding company, and then with subsidiaries dealing with the services on the one hand and the infrastructure on the other hand. In Germany also you have several infrastructure companies dealing with the core infrastructure, for instance, DB Netz, but also with the stations, for instance, or with other type of rail-related service facilities, as we call them, like marshalling yards, for instance, or maintenance facilities. The legislation also imposes to separate the accounts between freight and passenger transport activities. And you will see the reason thereof. We have seen that more than 50% of passenger services across the EU are subject to public service contracts, meaning that they are generally subsidized by the authorities. And the idea here is to avoid that public funds granted to the railway undertakings in charge of public service passenger public transport would subsidize, cross-subsidize freight, commercial freight services. Therefore, there are some obligations also to separate these activities. And then I have already mentioned the possibility to have rail-related service facilities operated by either separate entities or the railway undertakings, as it might be also the case. When they are operated by railway undertakings, which also have a dominant position in the transport service market, then there should be some independence in the organization and the decision-making process between both activities. And the accounts must also be separate. The idea again is always to have the possibility to avoid as much as possible conflicts of interest between the railway undertaking and the infrastructure or rail-related service facility manager, which also can have some railway undertaking, other railway undertaking using the facility or the infrastructure. I don't know if there are any comments or questions at this stage before we get to behavioral remedies. Okay, so let's go to the more behavioral related remedies that are provided for in the ex-ante regulation of the railways. As also is often the case in these regulated network industries, the manager of the infrastructure must grant access to the operators, and it must grant access in a non-discriminatory manner to any railway undertaking that is authorized to run trains on the network. This non-discriminatory access is compulsory for the core infrastructure and infrastructure connecting service facilities. The infrastructure manager must also grant the minimum access package services, meaning that it must, of course, not only give access to the network, but also control the trains so that they are not colliding together. And also it should, for instance, provide use of electrical supply equipment for the traction current to power the locomotives. These are basic necessary services that are to be provided to the railway undertakings to allow them basically run their trains. This must happen in a transparent manner, and there is there are a lot of rules specific regarding the publication of network statement containing detailed information on the use of the network, technical information, but also the way the infrastructure manages the network, the way it allocates the capacity, the formula for the pricing of the use of the infrastructure. This information must all be included in the network statement that is published on the website of the infrastructure manager. And possibly as well, the infrastructure manager can enter into agreements with the parties, with the railway undertakings, and this must also be complied with by the infrastructure manager. Of course, any agreement should be aligned with the general rules, the network statement, to avoid any discrimination between railway undertakings. We have also mentioned already that the pricing of the use of the infrastructure is also subject to specific rules and must be published by the infrastructure manager. According to the directive and its implementing acts, the charging principles allow for some leeway to the infrastructure manager. However, there is a strict framework, namely consisting of a minimum. The minimum price should be the cost that is directly incurred as a result of operating the train service. Namely, we take into account the way the network is being used by the railway undertakings, and this should be covered by the minimum charges applied by the infrastructure manager. And there is also a maximum that is set, which is the total costs incurred by the infrastructure manager, and which can be recovered through markups. However, this maximum can only be reached if the market can bear it, and if there is no exclusion of railway undertakings that are normally or otherwise capable to pay the cost directly incurred by additional trains on the network, plus a rate of return which the market can bear. Between the minimum and the maximum, there are a lot of other possibilities. For instance, it is possible also to charge for specific environmental elements like noise, and to take into account noise into the infrastructure charge formula. And in general, it is considered that infrastructure charges account for approximately 15% of the total production costs of railway undertakings. So it's an important element in the cost of railway undertakings, and you may see also a lot of debate regarding the infrastructure charges that are considered to be quite high across the EU. This may be also further explained by the fact that infrastructure managers must present their accounts in balance. Namely that their expenses should be balanced by their revenues and their subsidies, and therefore they are not allowed to make large debts, and under the EU legislation. At least for a certain period of time, they must be in balance in their account, and that means also that sometimes the infrastructure charges may be very high, and even if they are close to the cost directly incurred by the operation of a train. So if they are close to the minimum allowed in or imposed into the directive, even in that case, you can hear that railway undertakings consider that the infrastructure charges are too high. I mentioned this also because you will see when we will come to the application of competition law in the sector that state aid law can play as a relief to this obligation of having this minimum price for charging the use of the infrastructure. And state aid may play then a role to reduce these costs for railway undertakings and allow them competing with the road, for instance. And maybe important also to stress that capacity has to be allocated by the infrastructure manager in a way that is also non-discriminatory and transparent. In principle, the slots, but in railways we would rather speak of capacity, can be granted for maximum 1 year, which is a working timetable period, that said, the infrastructure manager may nevertheless conclude a framework agreement with the users for a period of 5 years to allow them, you know, have a better view on the the path that they can use in the coming 5 years. Also, there is a specific schedule in the directive on how to allocate the capacity, and in principle, once you are outside this schedule, there is no way to obtain your capacity in the regular manner. However, of course, there is a possibility to make ad hoc requests, but then of course the requester would not have the priority compared to the ones that would have complied with the schedule for capacity allocation. This is very technical, of course, but very important for railway undertakings to be allowed to provide their services on the respective networks. If there are congestion, if there is a congestion of the network and there is a conflict between the requests, then there might be also priority criteria that would apply. And generally what would happen is that passenger services would have often priority above freight services, which is considered to be a huge problem by freight operators, because they of course have to to delay their services to the benefit of passenger services. So there again, it might be an important point for some railway undertakings. Infrastructure managers are obliged also to inform in due time interested parties of their maintenance of the network. And here again, it is a point that is often raised by railway undertakings, that there are works that are not necessarily mentioned in due time, and therefore they have to delay their services, which then in turn also reduces the attractiveness of the sector compared, for instance, to road or airways. And the regulatory body, of course, is also supervising all these tasks of the infrastructure manager. And lastly, maybe another point that is interesting to mention, but please refer to the directive if you want more details. In the event of a disturbance to train movements, which are caused, for instance, by technical failures, the infrastructure manager must take all the necessary steps to restore the situation to the normal. So we see that there are a lot of rules that are aimed to make the transport services as smooth as possible on the networks. These behavioral remedies, as we have seen, are all imposed upon the infrastructure manager. Here there are maybe a last, there is a last element which relates not to the core infrastructure, but to rail-related service facilities. As mentioned, these services and the facilities may be managed by other entities than the infrastructure manager, which is in principle independent from the railway undertakings. These services and facilities may be managed also by railway undertakings themselves. And therefore, there are also some rules to make sure that that they would be available, and the operators of service facilities, such as, for instance, marshalling yard or stations, must provide the basic services in a non-discriminatory way. And also their price should not exceed the cost of providing the service plus a reasonable profit. They can only reject requests if they can show that there is a viable alternative under economically acceptable market conditions for the railway undertakings making the request. So this goes quite far, but is considered to be necessary to indeed allow railway undertakings operating on the networks, because although these are not pertaining to the core infrastructure, these services and facilities are necessary to provide the service, the rail transport services. Now we have seen in large lines what are provided, what is provided for in the directive to introduce competition, to allow competition in the transport markets. And I would propose now to see how competition law, being antitrust and state aid law, can play a role also to introduce such competition, or even to accelerate the liberalization of the sector. I don't know, Valérie, if we do now maybe a break of 5 minutes, or if we continue until the end. For me, it's the same.
I don't know. According to me, we can continue, but does anyone see an objection to that? No. It's almost the end, so no, I would say we go straight and then we finish. Okay.
That's good. Okay. No, my pleasure. But maybe before going to the role of competition law in railways to create such competitive markets, I don't know if there are any questions or reflections that would be shared. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Here I basically try to show how regulation applies, and I think it's interesting also to compare it with other regulated network industries, because in railway I have the impression that the regulation is really based on assumptions. Also, it shows that we are still in the early stage of liberalization. The rules really flow from the European norms. We have seen very important remedies that are adopted in the directive, and that are to be transposed in national law. So these are based on assumptions, based on forecasts, and they relate basically to the infrastructure manager and the operators of rail-related services. They are, as mentioned, transposed in national rules, and the regulatory body supervises the application of these rules. The regulatory body does not have much more leeway in imposing new elements or behavior, it mostly would enforce these European norms in the regulatory decisions that it would take. Whereas in other sectors, for instance, in the telecom, the role of the regulatory body would be more important. It would have to analyze whether or not there is a significant importance on the market, significant power, and depending on the situation, it might take a decision or not to further regulate the market. So here it's a bit, we are more upfront to that. And a lot would depend on the directive. The regulatory body is more like an enforcer of these rules. And of course, this plays also towards the ex post EU antitrust rules that might apply in parallel. And here I mention a few cases that are relating to the way the Commission or the courts have used antitrust rules to improve or to create really competitive rail markets. I do not look at cases, although there are other cases, of course, also that are quite relevant, but not for the purpose of here showing to you how we get to competition in the rail transport market. I wanted to mention this ENS case, the European Night Services case, which is an old case that was decided on the basis of 101 of the treaty, and which related to the creation of a joint venture between several railway undertakings, which were at the time also fully integrated as managers of infrastructure, and which was deemed to be anti-competitive by the Commission, but justified under 101 paragraph 3 of the treaty. And the court considered that it wasn't demonstrated that the agreement that the JV would have restrictive effect on the competition. And the reasoning was interesting. It said that at the time there was an obligation to grant access to train paths based on the regulation, and therefore the agreement cannot, by definition, impede access to infrastructure. Also, an interesting point was that the relevant market was considered to be intermodal because rail could be also replaced by the road, and therefore the locomotives were not considered as essential, and therefore even if we had to consider that the market was intramodal, applicable only between railway services, there was no proof that it cannot be bought, that locomotives cannot be bought or rented out on the market. Well, this is an old case, and now let us look at what happened regarding dominance of abuse of dominant position under Article 102 of the treaty. There was also a relatively old case relating to Ferrovie dello Stato, which was considered to abuse its dominant position by refusing the railway undertaking GVG from entering an international grouping for international passenger services. And it did so by refusing access to the network and refusing to provide traction. And the traction is to be considered and is to be understood as providing the locomotives, but also the drivers for the locomotive, the maintenance, the repair, and the backup for these services. So it was considered basically that without traction, the service cannot be provided, and therefore it was considered to be abusive. Also, there had been a case regarding Deutsche Bahn, which was said to abuse its dominant position by pricing traction current in a way that created a margin squeeze on rail transport markets in Germany. And therefore, Deutsche Bahn made some commitments that were accepted. And notably, it boiled down to DB separating the services, the infrastructure services from the traction current services, and making renouncing to rebates that it was granting on the basis of volume for traction current, and which basically it was the only one that could benefit from these rebates, and therefore it stopped granting these rebates. We see that having such vertical structure may, of course, also lead to more problems, or potentially to some issues relating to margin squeeze. What is quite often also invoked in the sector. This case is an interesting one and also quite recent, and it's called the Baltic Rail case, where the Lithuanian railways were operating for an industry, and at some point there had been a competitor willing to provide services from the refinery that we see. I don't know if you see the dot here, and the services were provided from the refinery to Latvia, so a refinery in Lithuania, and then further distributed in Latvia. And at some point, there had been a competitor willing to provide these services, and the Lithuanian railways simply decided to remove the tracks between the refinery and the Latvian border. And therefore, the competitor had to take this blue way, which is much longer, costs much more, and takes much more time to provide exactly the same service that was possible under with the red tracks that you can see here. And we can see here the picture of the removed tracks. The Commission fined the Lithuanian railway for having removed these tracks, as it had an anti-competitive effect on the market. And this decision had been confirmed by the General Court, although the General Court reduced the fine with 28%. And the case is interesting to read. The General Court and the Commission, following the Commission, retained two relevant markets, an upstream market with the management of rail infrastructures, which is considered to be national, a legal monopoly, and the downstream market with rail freight services of oil products, determined on the basis of origin and destination, and where the Lithuanian railways were considered to be dominant, because at that time it was the only provider of services. And then the infringement consisted of abusing the dominant position in removing the tracks with anti-competitive foreclosure effects on the downstream market, by creating barriers to entry for an efficient competitor, and this without objective justification. Of course, the Lithuanian railways invoked safety reasons and other reasons, but it was analyzed and by the Commission and the court, and concluded that these justifications were not objective, and the legal monopoly had not itself invested in the network. It was a network that was built with public money, and this aspect was also taken into account. The court considered that, as you know, so the essential facility doctrine and the Brauner case, but the court considered that the Brauner case is not applicable in this case, because the rail regulation imposes access to the infrastructure, and the infrastructure was built with public funds. So it is not necessary to demonstrate that access to the infrastructure is indispensable for the competitor to enter the market. It's very interesting because it can be also applied, of course, in other sectors than the railways, it might be further confirmed by the Court of Justice. Going to state aid. Well, I mentioned regarding the prices of the use of infrastructure, that state aid can play a role in relieving railway undertakings from some high costs. I haven't provided here any specific example in the slides, but I think you have some examples in the reading list that you have received. And there are some cases that had been approved by the Commission, where member states were allowed to reduce the level of the infrastructure charges, even below the cost directly incurred by the operation of additional trains on the network. And this constitutes a state aid, an advantage, an economic advantage to railway undertakings. And the Commission had approved some of these cost reductions, for instance, in Germany, but also in the Netherlands. And these are very welcomed decisions by railway operators across the EU. I mentioned here some individual state aid cases relating to debt cancellation or restructuring of railway undertakings, because I believe also that these cases show that although the legislation might provide for a liberalization that is not yet fully completed, the appraisal of the Commission when approving a state aid may also be linked with further remedies or commitments from member states to open up a bit more rapidly their network to competition. And this is the case of the Polish railways. It's a relatively recent case of last year. The Commission had examined this restructuring aid granted to the public Polish passenger regional railways under the General Treaty Rules of Article 107.3c. And it considered also that it may not apply the rules that would normally apply to restructuring aid, namely the rules contained in the rescue and restructuring aid guidelines, because the rail transport sector knows exceptional circumstances, and these exceptional circumstances are that passenger rail sector is in a specific situation because it is not yet fully liberalized, and also because there might be a risk of disruption of the services of general economic interest or public service obligation, as we have seen that a lot of passenger services are under public service contracts, are provided for the benefit of the interests of the general interest. However, the Commission, although was willing to look at this case under less strict rules maybe, or with more leeway than provided for under the restructuring aid guidelines, it also imposed upon Poland to accelerate the opening up of the Polish regional passenger rail transport sector to competition. So it's interesting because it attached remedy to the approval of an aid provided for to a railway undertaking. So maybe to wrap up on regulation and competition law as applied in the railway sector, we see that old antitrust cases were a bit at odds with what we now know, because if a behavior complied with the regulation, then it was decided that there should not be any restriction of competition. However, since then we know also that the behavior of a company has been, although it has been regulated or determined by a regulatory body, the company, if it has some leeway to engage in anti-competitive behavior, it retains liability under competition law. These were the case of, for instance, the Deutsche Telekom case. So we have evolved there. Also, more recently, the case of the Lithuanian railway showed that the appraisal is a bit different, in the sense that where there is an obligation to grant access to an infrastructure, for instance, or to an asset that is legally imposed, then there is no need to show that it is essential for competitors to access to prove that there might be an abuse of dominant position in refusing such access. So we see that there are some developments also there, and that there is some complementarity between competition law and the regulation. Also, the specific situation of railways may justify deviation from the general state aid rules, as we have seen in the Polish case. But also in recent cases, liberalization could be forced anticipatively as a condition to grant the state aid. So this is also interesting to see how the Commission tries to introduce more competition in the sector through state aid. I don't know if there are any further comments, questions, or remarks regarding regulation and competition law in the railway sector. Otherwise, I would just wrap up with some takeaways from what I think this presentation should bear for you. So the railways clearly present specific features that call for specific rules, and ex-ante regulation really tries to introduce progressively competition in contestable railway service markets. And this is due to the fact that the markets as such are coming from a situation of monopoly, fully integrated monopoly, and therefore competition alone cannot introduce such competition into these markets. But competition law really plays a complementary role to the regulation, and is therefore also important to take into account, and an important tool to ensure that the markets are competitive. And that's it for the presentation. Any remarks, any reflections?
Well, I might throw in some, if I may, some ideas that we often have in Germany. I mean, Germany has undoubtedly probably one of the best railway infrastructure system in the world. However, our railway freight services are still far away from being competitive to road transportation services. Do you think that the strong regulation of the railway system could be one of the reasons why private companies would still prefer to not choose railway systems?
Yeah, I think this observation is not only valid for Germany. We have seen also the modal share of freight rail services, and it is not very high across the EU. So your point is valid elsewhere as well. And whether strong regulation plays a role in this respect, well, the sector itself really points at various elements. And I think we have touched upon them also through the presentation, but it might be useful to recall that certainly freight operators are quite critical about the management of the infrastructure, the fact that they would often give priority to passenger services, which then translate in delays in their services towards their customers that are often also dependent on further services with maritime shipping transports afterwards. So they may really miss the whole schedule. So they are quite critical about this, the quality of the infrastructure, but this is also linked to the fact that there would be more investment on specific tracks dedicated to passenger services, much more than for freight services, and also the level of infrastructure charges. They would consider that they increase their costs quite a lot and make them anti-competitive compared to road services that do not support or they do not cover to the same extent the external costs. You know, these effects on environment and on congestion, they are barely factored into the costs of road. So these elements all make really the railways at a disadvantage compared to road, and regulation may play a role. Of course, it has to be enforced. However, there is also a need for member states, if they want to promote railway services, because we often hear also in Germany, strong railways. It's a full program in Germany. We speak a lot of railways being the way to achieve some climate objectives. However, there must be some more investment made in the sector to improve the situation, certainly compared to road. So this is why I think that competition also can play competition law can play a role besides regulation. But also there is a need for political decisions to be adopted there.
Yeah, I agree. It's always difficult to intervene or trying to open the market by the means of competition law when you have a strong national regulation. We've also seen something similar in the German mail services, post and mail service, which was until 2007 highly regulated, basically monopolized, and now there are mail consolidation providers, service providers going into the market and getting more and more market shares, and are actually already trying to challenge the Deutsche Post. But in a highly regulated sector, it's always a question if there is even a need for competition law, or to what extent should we apply competition laws, since the regulation itself can take away all the benefits that competition law could seek for.
Yeah. Yes and no. I think really competition law may be complementary to regulation, huh? And the more recent competition cases that we have examined here in the session really show that there might be improvement thanks to competition law. I haven't mentioned, but there are also cases you might have heard of cases relating to the Bundeskartellamt. As you come from Germany, the Bundeskartellamt apparently opened an investigation against Deutsche Bahn for not sharing its data on its rail transport services for passengers, and thereby hindering the development of mobility platforms. Well, these are, of course, cases that might force at some point also the incumbent to share its data, and possibly also promote public transport more in general. So we see that there are some developments in Poland. There had been this commitment to open up the sector following the approval of the state aid to the regional operator. So there might be some further development thanks to competition law, really to fix what the regulation has not achieved or could not achieve, or at least what was not fully enforced by the regulator.
I think we will soon discover whether competition law may give rise to new incumbents, especially in the rail sector, since Flixbus is already for a few years trying to establish themselves on the rail as well, now that they established themselves on the road. And there's a lot of skepticism with regard to the question if they will manage, and if they, after all the service fees that they will have to pay to the Deutsche Bahn to be able to use the infrastructure, will be able to still offer competitive prices. But I think if somebody can manage, then it will be them. So I think in a few years we will have the answer to the question if competition law makes sense in that sector.
Well, what would be your alternative then in this respect? What do you think? If competition law does not make sense, or maybe would you then even advocate not to open up the markets? Because this is also a debate, whether or not competition can ever work in railways. What would be your views then?
Well, I think whatever decision you make, you should be consistent. I mean, it comes also one of the reasons, especially in Germany, why a few sectors are highly regulated is just because it's part of the history. I mean, around 100 years ago, those systems were maintained by the government. And especially with the Deutsche Bahn, there have been discussions to privatize them. A lot of people also say that the reason why a lot of things in the past few years went wrong at the German railway system is just owed to the fact that they are owned by the state. And I think there should be a European framework for regulated sectors, just providing some general legislation to what extent you can state regulate certain sectors. And you also always have to ask yourself the question, do we need to put some extra legislation and regulation on that sector? Or is it not maybe just a market like any other market, and should we just leave that market up to a full competition and let the market sort it out for themselves? So my approach would just rather go into the direction to deregulate and to try to impose a European framework for regulation in the railway sector, and then see if, for example, Deutsche Bahn has to grant access to the infrastructure to other players as well. If not, we can lower the prices considerably, and by that mean also put forward our ideas that we had with establishing the Green Deal and reaching the goals that were set out in that, because to me that sounds way more promising than the way that we have now, with also in Germany especially train ticket prices skyrocketing, and skyrocketing that high that now even our government had to intervene and offer tickets at a ridiculously low level, and already having a lot of criticism or earning a lot of criticism for that, with regard to the question who should pay for that. And I think whenever you have those situations that you have to kind of have some extra inputs from politics just because there's an unjust result, that's an incentive or an indication that something went wrong, and that something happened that should not have been there, and that shouts for some changes there. But it's just my opinion as a young competition lawyer.
Well, very well built. So that's I think it's interesting to hear, and of course everyone can have an opinion on how best approaching these regulated network industries, whether or not competition works at all. There are a lot of debates, certainly for railways. Many doubt whether competition is ever a solution, certainly for passenger services. This is also why you have seen that the liberalization is not yet complete for rail passenger services. So these are valid points to raise. But I think that we should also certainly keep in mind that where we come from, what are also the specificities of the sector. And for instance, railways in Europe, this is not railways in the United States or in other continents. The network is very dense in Europe, and passenger services are quite important. So this may have played a role in determining the way the sector is now organized, indeed. But thank you for sharing also your views. I don't know if there are other comments in this respect that would be interesting also to hear.
Well, could you maybe just quickly point out 1 to 3 opinions that would, in your opinion, speak for a high regulation in the railway sector, that they are like inevitable to enable the functioning, if there are any? I just find it difficult to think of any.
Okay. I think also that in the presentation you would find the elements that I believe are also important, in the sense that if we want to have competition on rail transport markets, which is considered to be potentially contestable, then indeed you have to regulate access to the network that is considered to be a legal and a natural monopoly. Otherwise, it would not be natural for these monopolies to necessarily provide their services in the way they have to today. And this is also, in my view, why at some point there had been a separation between what was considered to be contestable, the transport services, from the infrastructure that is considered to be a natural monopoly. And this is why I think that certainly as the markets now function, you cannot remove regulation. It is far too early. In maybe other regulated network industries, you can start deregulating. This was also one of the points, that I tried to make with when I showed the role of the regulatory body. But in the railways, the markets are not yet sufficiently dynamic to phase out ex ante regulation and let the market play their role. So I think it makes sense to have regulation as applied to the infrastructure manager and the rail service facility operators, to ensure that there is some competition that can take place on the transport services. So I really believe that we are in the phase of opening up the market through ex ante regulation, as possibly complemented, further helped with competition law. I don't know if this answers your point, but I would really refer to these slides as discussed today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point, and it brings us back to often discussed question if EU's essential facility doctrine is far enough outgoing. But that's definitely a point that is worth mentioning, especially if you look at the situation and how many competitors there are in the different countries. Basically none. So it's definitely a valid argument. Thanks a lot.
No, you're welcome. Any other reflections or questions?
No. So, okay. Well, if there are any, please shoot now or never. No, thank you all for joining this Friday afternoon. And next week we will have a full session, but starting at 2 p.m. So please notice that, because Alexandre Destrel is living in the United States. So It's for that reason that we are doing it a bit later. We will finish around 6 at that time, but today we finish earlier. I hope that's not an issue for none of you. Thank you all for joining, and I'm wishing you a good weekend. If you have any question, always email me, or you can call me as well. Thank you. Thank you again, Carol, for joining us today and for all your precious insights. And I hope we will be able to see you face to face before the graduation, at least.
Yeah, me too. I thank you also. Thank you also for your participation.
Yes.
And good luck with the exams.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.